This is Sean Galloway. I'm coordinator for the History Project, Carroll County Remembers, and we're here today to talk with Mr. George Murphy about some of the things he's seen in Carroll County, his expertise in Carroll County. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Murphy.
A pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to start with what you know. How long have you been in Carroll County?
I've been in Carroll County since 1993. And for the past 10 years, I've been involved, along with Pastor James E. Hinton, in the restoration of Ellsworth Cemetery and in the restoration of the other historically black cemeteries in Carroll County.
For those who may not know, where is Ellsworth Cemetery?
Cemetery is located off Leidy Road, which was historically the old Baltimore Boulevard, which was the key road that connected Baltimore and Westminster.
Okay. All right, and what are some of the things that you're doing to help restore some of the black cemeteries in the area?
We've been over the years seeking grants from the Carroll Community Foundation, which we've successfully gotten, from Prince George's Community Foundation, from the Westminster class of the year 2000, and we've had help from the Boy Scouts of the local area. And we've had a long-time relationship with the Branch 7014 of the NAACP, as well as the churches in Carroll County.
So you have a lot of people coming together to try to make this thing happen and make the restorations come to life. So my next question is, why is it so important?
This is living history. If you can restore these cemeteries, you can restore the memory and names of those who have gone before us. People like the founders of Ellsworth Cemetery, William Massey, David Ireland, Mr. Adams, Mr. Nelson Edwards, veterans of the Civil War, people who went and fought for their freedom and won their freedom. The history of that generation of men is very important to remember.
Okay. And what are some of the things that are happening to the gravesite that need them to be restored? Are they just old and the headstones are like falling apart, or are they being vandalized? Or
we've had some vandalism in the past. There was one stone of Mary Sheen who was smashed into 20 pieces, a beautiful stone, and we managed to put it back together. Other stones, like large obelisks, have to be maintained, new foundations put on them. In the original design of the cemetery, most of the plots were only 8 foot in depth, and as a result, after the grave was dug, the stones would tend to settle in towards the center. Unless they were highly maintained and you went back every year, they would fall in. So what we've managed to do is restore 150 monuments, about half of whom had fallen or were invisible.
What are some of the notable names, and what parts do they play in Carroll County's history in some of these cemeteries?
The oldest man to have ever lived in Carroll County was Nicholas Parraway. He lived to be 110 years of age. He was born in 1766 and died in 1876. Here's a man who was born a slave before this country was even founded, who in fact volunteered to go to the War of 1812 and was told he was too old, but who lived to see his freedom and lived to be a celebrated citizen of this county. He was a hero to the Republican Party in Carroll County after the Civil War. Every 4th of July, he would be part of the parades. He'd have his own carriage and driver, and he would carry placards supporting the Republican Party. He was called Old Uncle Nick by everyone, and he was really a civic hero. Another man who was one of the founders was Samuel Bowens. He served in the Civil War, but he did not serve in what was called the United States Colored Troops. He did not serve in a segregated branch of the United States Army. He served with the Connecticut Cavalry. He was a brave man who has a very nice obituary written about him as an honorable and trustworthy man. There are other people like David Warfield, who served in the Union Army at the age of 16. And what did he go into battle with? He went into battle with a drum. Can you imagine sitting in the battle formations outside of Cold Harbor, the Battle of Cold Harbor in Virginia, and all you have is a drum? And that morning, Ulysses S. Grant assaulted fixed fortifications built by an engineering genius named Robert E. Lee, and he lost 5,000 men that morning. That's the kind of courage it took to fight in a civil war on either side. These are men whose most important experience in their life was giving their life, risking their life on behalf of the United States of America. These men are the ones who founded Ellsworth Cemetery. They designed Ellsworth Cemetery. It is laid out like a military parade ground with ordered rows named for the states of the Union. And it has a central round walking area with a single obelisk. It was well designed. It is in fact a Victorian garden almost. Some of the most elegant stones ever carved in Carroll County are there. I recently had the occasion to take one of her stones, which was partially broken, and carry it to the Carroll County Historical Society, where an exhibit is going to be arranged around it, and it was a stone hand-carved by Boss Hammond, who was a stone carver who worked in slate. This stone, which is in absolutely beautiful condition, is probably the best example in the Carroll County Historical Society or the Maryland Historical Trust of a native black man's work. He was a man who, it is said, could not read nor write, but who could make slate carvings of crow quill as elegant as any you'll see. And it was my honor to take that stone where it can be in safekeeping.
Now, I want to backtrack just a little.
Sure.
You mentioned the oldest man to ever live in Carroll County. What was his name again?
Nicholas Parraway.
Nicholas Parraway. How old was he when he tried to volunteer for the War of 1812 to be turned away?
He was born in 1766. The War of 1812 was sometime after that, so he was approaching, he was in the 40s.
Oh, so he was he wanted to do his part.
And he was told he was too old at that time. He was, in fact, going to volunteer to go along with his master's oldest son. And his master said, "Oh, you're too old, Nick." Little did he know how old Nick would become.
Okay. That's a great story. So getting back to the restoration of the cemeteries, what steps have to be taken in the actual restoration process? Say a broken headstone to restore the history of Carroll County.
You've got to think of it as archaeology, because that's really what it is. What you have to do when you have one of these cemeteries is find its meets and bounds, find where it begins, where it ends. Then you have to survey it to find all the stones that are erect. Then you have to take those stones and write them, plumb them. In other words, you have to oftentimes put new foundations underneath them and then erect them so they're true. And what I like to do is, after we have repaired those stones which are leaning and make them straight, then we start exploring. Then we start probing the ground and finding stones in many cases. The stone of Ephraim Smith, a Civil War soldier, was found a foot below ground because we were probing and we found his stone and brought it up. So his memory, which was erased, is now alive. It's very much like archaeology in that you have to do these graveyards in stages. When we did Ellsworth, we laid it out in 6 zones, and we attacked each zone, found all the stones that were obvious, repaired them, and probed and found the other stones. And we went from section by section by section by section. And it is very much like an archaeological site, and it has to be treated as such, because a lot of these tombstones are the only records of these men and women's lives. Prior to the creation of these graveyards, almost all people of color in this county had no memorial. They were, unfortunately, interned in fields and forgotten, often with just rude, rough stones. With the creation of Ellsworth Cemetery and the other historically black cemeteries, they preserve their memory for their posterity. And it is my honor to work along with James Hinton, Alice Green, and others to restore that history, but it is living history. It is archaeology. It's very sophisticated. And the way you go about repairing stones today is completely different than what was used to be done. There used to be, when stones were broken, a type of glue was used, or what they called German mortar, which was a granite paste. And that granite paste tended to be harder than the material of the stones. We work mostly in marble. Marble is very soft. And when these glues and epoxies were used, they were harder than the marble, and inevitably the marble would break right there repeatedly. So today we use a high-grade silicone caulk which breathes just like marble breathes. Marble is very porous and expands and contracts, and the silicone expands and contracts with it. So the techniques you use to repair them have completely changed. The way we have repaired the bases of these stones, we use a mix of stone dust and Portland cement, usually 3-to-1, and we excavate down 18 inches, and we build a base of a dry mix of stone dust and Portland cement 2 inches bigger than the base, and we let it sit overnight, and it absorbs the moisture from the ground and becomes almost as hard as granite. And then we can lay down a layer of silicone, put the foundation on, and just the weight of the stone itself will flatten out the silicone and make a virtually airtight seal, better than steel pins which used to be used. And then you take the rest of the monument and you also clean it, scrub it, and you put down that silicone again, and the weight of the stone will hold it in the wind. Now, when we repaired John Baptiste Snowden's stone, John Baptiste Snowden bought his own freedom at the age of 29. He founded the Union Street United Methodist Church. His stone is in Ellsworth Cemetery. His stone is built in 8 stages. It is the tallest, perhaps one of the finest stones you'll see anywhere in a graveyard. But it was in 8 stages. And the original foundation, which was brick, was made well. But over the course of 100 years, all the mortar had worked out. And the stone itself was actually spinning in the wind. So what we did was we used a Carroll County resident's skill, Mr. Walter Taylor, who's a 5th-generation stonemason, and he and his crew came out and used the original bricks, poured a new concrete foundation over top of those bricks, and then mounted stage by stage by stage the obelisk for the Snowden family cemetery, their family plot. John Baptiste Snowden was one of the most prominent and important black people in Carroll County. He not only founded a church, bought his own freedom, he preserved the memory of his grandmother, who was an African princess, whose name I have, and whose legend is on paper in the Carroll County Historical Society. And I have worked out an agreement with the Carroll County Historical Society to write a book. Its title is Ellsworth Forever. In that book, I intend to record for posterity the obituaries of dozens and dozens of those who have fallen and are in Ellsworth. It is also important to know, for the sake of history, the reason why Ellsworth was founded outside the city limits of Westminster, as was many of the town cemeteries for blacks, was that it was illegal for blacks to be buried inside the city limits. In those unfortunate days, it was considered to be polluting the ground of the town to have people of color buried within it. So as a result, even the residents of the Alms House in Westminster who died were taken to Ellsworth, which is outside the town limits. And that is why we have a stranger's row, because many of the poor of color who died in Westminster were taken to Ellsworth and interned there. In town after town, at the turn of the century, with the rise of the resegregation of America, particularly because of the 1914, 1915 era, when Birth of a Nation was a movie sensation. A lot of towns enacted codes which made it impossible for blacks and whites to live together. You were segregated at birth, you were segregated the entire time you were alive, and even in death you were segregated. But it is also a reward of history that these people's separate burials can be separately saved. And in a lot of cases, there is a tremendous amount of history, and history that is organized on the basis of race, but which is so rich and actually representative of the walks of life of every American. I have found over the years a tremendous amount of enthusiasm by blacks and whites for this project. It is my intention, along with Pastor James E. Hinton, to restore 8 cemeteries this year, 2 in Frederick County, 6 in Carroll County. We intend to repair every monument, plumb and straighten every tombstone, repair every broken marker, and to erect fences around the metes and bounds of the property. And if you get a chance to go out to Ellsworth Cemetery, you'll see we have a very dignified and elegant arch at the entrance. And we want to put arches at the entrances to all these historically black cemeteries because they are places of honor. Here are hundreds of Civil War combat veterans scattered across 8 sites in 2 counties. And when we are done, we want everyone, black and white, in Carroll and Frederick counties to remember that the great emancipator might have issued a proclamation granting them freedom, but their courage, their willingness to go into combat, whether armed with a rifle, a bugle, or a drum, earned them their freedom and earns our respect. And we will always keep this sacred ground in a high state of condition.
Okay. Now, going back to Mr. Snowden and some of the other veterans that are in these cemeteries, do they have any surviving relatives that you may know of in Carroll County that may be around today?
Yes. Many members of the Brightful family, the Charms families, the Dorsey, the Lewises, the Masseys, their descendants are here in Carroll County and will always be here. And it is part of the charm of having done this work and the privilege of doing this work to being approached by relatives of and descendants of these men and women to be thanked. That means an awful, awful lot. I would like to add that the Ellsworth Cemetery Company, of whom I am vice president, has only got 1 paid employee, and that's Reverend James E. Hinton, and he makes $1 a year. So we are, having been established in 1876, perhaps the oldest nonprofit in the state of Maryland. We may have been founded by 6 Civil War veterans, but we are a racially integrated company, and we are going to continue the work that they started.
Excellent. And how much can it cost to save a cemetery when we're talking about something that this old?
Well, if you take just an individual stone, we have a stone of black granite for Cornelius Brown. That stone itself, a single stone, its foundation stone was approximately this wide and this deep. And the headstone was much heavier. It weighed 5 tons. It took a crane to lift it. So sometimes you can dedicate up to $500 to $1,000 just for the repair of a single monument. In the case of John Baptiste Snowden's family obelisk, it took 3 days to really repair it. So that might cost $400 or $500. When you're talking about the materials to repair a cemetery, what you need to do is level it and smooth it. It takes tons and tons of topsoil brought in and grade it out. It takes a lot of muscle, a lot of elbow grease, a lot of time. The materials are not that expensive. The topsoil, the Portland cement, the stone dust, and even the fencing. But it's the time and the effort behind it. I would estimate that we have spent about $40,000 over the years in the last 10 years at Ellsworth Cemetery on materials, fencing, cement, skilled repair, use of cranes at that site. But the amount of labor, volunteer labor that has gone into it to maintain it would probably be 3 or 4 times that. But that generally is donated. An important thing to do with all these cemeteries is to establish ownership, legal right of title, and a survey to get the metes and bounds of the property. Because once we have identified these cemeteries, we want to make sure that there is no intrusion by neighbors. There is a cemetery in Eldisburg, the New Laurel Cemetery, which has been fallen under the original ownership and which has been used lately for people to throw their household trash into. And there are cemeteries like Mount Olivet in Frederick County, which, because it is isolated off a gravel road, has become overgrown. And unless you've been there and walked it, you don't know exactly how much history is there. In the Harrisonville Road Cemetery outside of Mount Airy, the Harrisonville Road used to follow the contours of the ground. And the cemetery for people of color was right next to there. Well, sometime in the 1950s, for the convenience of cars, they decided to change the contour of the road. So they elevated the road that left the cemetery sunken 12 to 15 foot below the road. So even to get into the cemetery, you can't walk off the road. You have to walk down the road and come back. These are hard to get to places. But once we get to them and restore them and fence them and give them the proper signage, then they'll be much easier to repair. These places get lost in the shuffle. Everybody wants to, in these hard economic times, make as much money as they can on developing lands. And a lot of times, people have ambitions where they see a large parcel of land that they own. They don't know where their own property ends. Unless somebody is there to defend these cemeteries, they could be torn apart, destroyed. Indeed, at the building of Northern Parkway in Baltimore City, an historically black cemetery, almost entirely of Union Army dead, 31 graves were bulldozed out of the way. And at Ellsworth Cemetery, we believe back in the 1950s, the original line of Ellsworth Cemetery followed the Baltimore Boulevard. And our original track was not the rectangle you see today, but a rectangle with a wedge at the end. When Leidy Road was realigned and the original contours of Baltimore Boulevard were changed, at the wedge was where the stillborn infants of the black community were buried. And when the Carroll County Commissioners changed Baltimore Boulevard to Leidy Road and realigned it, they bulldozed out the stillborns. They in fact cracked off with a bulldozer or tractor over a dozen stones that I know of. And I have photographs of the places where they were because they cracked the stones off and their foundations, pushed them into a pile, and changed the alignment of the road so it could be developed. The adjacent parcel could be developed. And in fact, the stone I just delivered last week to the Carroll County Historical Society is broken in 2 places. And it was broken when Leidy Road was realigned. It, along with those stones for the other children, were crushed and put into a pile. I recovered that stone from 1.5 feet down. The only reason why I found it was because I was looking very closely at the grounds and I saw white marble. And I said, this doesn't make any sense. Why is there white marble at grass level? And I started digging. And then I found fragment after fragment after fragment of broken stones. And there, down around that deep at a severe angle, was this hand-carved slate tombstone made by Boss Hammond for a child of one of his friends. And it is, as far as we know, the only tombstone that has survived that was carved by his hand for a black person. Most of his stones were done for commercial reasons and are scattered across a lot of cemeteries in Carroll and Frederick County. But that stone was broken in the movement of Baltimore Boulevard and its conversion to Leidy Road. I would hasten to point out that the Leidy family is a wonderful family. They are our neighbors and have always looked after the cemetery. And Mr. Leidy told me that when he was a young man, his family, which had a tannery historically there, had a Mr. William Curry in their employ. Mr. William Curry was part Native American and part black. And when he died, after working a very long time for the Leidy family, he could not be buried in Westminster. So he was buried at Ellsworth, and I know his location. He does not have a stone today. Many of these Civil War veterans I am talking about as having founded and served their country don't have stones. There are over a dozen of their stones that will be ordered from the Veterans Administration and installed. We intend in May to have a great rededication of Ellsworth Cemetery. Pastor James E. Hinton has prevailed upon the Buffalo Soldiers Reenactors Group to come to Ellsworth with their horses. And we intend to ask the American Legion and the Buffalo Soldiers Reenactors Group to call the roll of the founders and all the veterans that we have restored to memory and to history. And we are going to have a long-standing agreement with the Westminster Rescue Mission. And we have up to 15 men and women at the Westminster Rescue Mission who are going to be helping us with the labor. And this agreement is a matter of religious and personal trust. It is a very important agreement because we want to redeem not only history but people. And the Westminster Rescue Mission and their pastor, Pastor Beal, Pastor Hinton, and myself are dedicated to preserving forever the history of Ellsworth Cemetery and these historically black cemeteries. Another point of note is that Ellsworth Cemetery is named not for a black man. It is named for Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was an acquaintance of Abraham Lincoln. Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was a New Yorker from Mechanicsville, New York. And after the Battle of Fort Sumter, he and his men, the Zouaves, which were a special infantry unit which wore bright red pants and blue jackets, very conspicuous, were ordered by Abraham Lincoln, since the Civil War had started, to cut off Alexandria and the rail lines to keep the South from being able to directly attack Washington, D.C. And Colonel Elmer Ellsworth led his men into Alexandria, cut the railroad lines, cut the telegraph lines between Richmond and Alexandria, and on the way back to the capital, saw at the hotel a huge Confederate flag. And he told his men, "We'll have to have that flag." So he went into the hotel along with one other man and pulled down the stars and bars. And as he gathered the Confederate flag, and as he was going down the steps, he was shot and killed by the proprietor of the hotel. He was the first Union officer to die in the Civil War. And it is in his memory that these veterans of the Civil War named Ellsworth Cemetery. And as Colonel Elmer Ellsworth's parents' greatest thought was that he did not die in vain. And when Elmer Ellsworth died, Abraham Lincoln wept at his funeral. All across the North, his death was in newspapers. And fury at the fact that he was shot from behind while taking down the rebel flag made one Union officer very mad, a Union officer who was at the time not in uniform. That was Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant re-enlisted in the Union Army after reading Elmer Ellsworth's obituary. In this time when everyone thinks of themselves and communities are divided, it should give us pause to remember that 6 Union Army veterans establishing their own cemetery in a very segregated era immortalized a white man for his courage, and we could do a little less for them.
That's awesome. Now, I want to go back a little bit,
Sure.
Actually back to the beginning. You said you came to Carroll County in 1993. Where'd you come from?
I was born and raised in farmland in Prince George's and Anne Arundel County. I moved to Woodlawn, and I raised 3 sons, and I moved from Woodlawn to Carroll County in 1993. And in 1999, there was a lot of discussion in Carroll County, particularly by the Carroll County Board of Education, about abolishing Martin Luther King's birthday as a holiday. At the time, I was an employee of the Board of Education, and I heard the board was going to abolish the Martin Luther King's birthday as a holiday. It was ironic that in this county we were going backwards while the rest of the nation was going forward. And I spoke twice to the Board of Education and appealed to them not to abolish it as a holiday, which they did. And I became quite exercised about it, and along with some other people, including Mr. and Mrs. Lewis and Pastor Hinton, Bernard Jones, and many, many others, too numerous to mention, we decided to organize a branch of the NAACP, recharter the branch in Carroll County. And we also resolved to overturn the Board of Education's decision. We invited and had to a meeting of concerned citizens at Union Memorial Baptist Church, the then superintendent of schools and a representative of the Board of Education. And they attempted to justify the abolition of Martin Luther King's birthday as a holiday because they had a different idea that they were going to have teach-ins. And at that point, it was Pastor Hinton who said 2 words: "We'll march." And that's what happened. We marched. And we won that particular battle. After that battle was over, we organized, had a meeting at the Westminster Library to organize a chapter of the NAACP. The state representative, Mr. Odom Jenkins, was there, and we needed to elect a roster of officers, and we did, but we had no treasurer. And I volunteered to be the treasurer of the NAACP and served as such for the first 6 of the 8 years of the organization. And so I was, in part, an organizer of this branch, 7014 in Carroll County. Very proud of my association with them, which association continues to this day.
Okay. If you could sum up in a few words, you know, in your own words, what was the main reason for them to want to abolish Dr. King's birthday in Carroll County?
There was a thought that was put out in the public that it would be more significant for students to be in school and have a chance to learn about Dr. Martin Luther King's message and life in school. However, there was also a feeling among some people that by doing this, it would set back his memory as well. I think there was a mixture of feelings, some of them not very kind. I think it's most appropriate we have a holiday in his name, and that we have a separate day where people can choose in their own way to reflect about what his message was. I'm somebody who grew up in the 1960s. I met, shook hands, and talked to Ralph David Abernathy, Martin Luther King's most important lieutenant. These type of people, people who were willing to die, whose homes were dynamited, who fought for the basic civil rights of all citizens, are very special people. They are like people who founded Ellsworth Cemetery, who answered a call. And as such, we should honor them in our own ways. So I really believe the Board of Education made the right move in reversing their previous decision and established Martin Luther King's birthday as a holiday for all students in Carroll County. And it was my honor to help in that effort.
That's awesome. Well, Mr. Murphy, I think we're running out of time here, but I think we just barely scratched the layer with you. So I would love to set up another time and talk to you again about some more things. I think you have so much more to offer to this history project. But I want to thank you for coming out today.
You're welcome.
And giving us all the information that you have. And like I said, I'd love to talk to you again and get some more information out of you. It's been a pleasure.
I'll be here.
All right. Thanks.